Let's go to our panel now. Amel Boubekeur joins us from Algiers. She's a French-Algerian researcher and author of What Happened to the Islamists. In Montreal is Raouf Farrah. He's the coordinator of the Algerian opposition group Engaged Youth Collective. And in Brussels, we have Andrew Lebovich, who's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you all on the program. Amel Boubekeur, let me start with you. The fact that this Constitutional Council cancelled or postponed those elections that were due very soon, does that mean that they're listening to the protesters? Are you encouraged?
No, absolutely not. These dynamics are totally disconnected. From the start, the priority of the people in the streets were not linked to new elections. It's linked to new institutions, a new way to do politics, to reappropriate the citizenship and state of law. It's also a way actually to reconduct and to reproduce the Algerian governance on the side of the army in order to elect a new president who will have all his powers in hand, with the army really ruling behind back doors. So the cancellation of the elections actually is only a step forward for the protesters in order to have a real negotiations, or to have real negotiations around a real genuine transitions and direction of new transparent institutions. But that's not the end of the project of the mass movement, not at all.
Raouf, is Amel's skepticism and perhaps cynicism justified?
I think it's totally justified. In Algeria today, the popular movement is still very, very strong. Algerians are very motivated to continue to protest until to change the structural elements that composes the Algerian system. Algerians are not in the streets just to ask for elections. Elections is actually the top of the iceberg. Algerians are asking for a state, a democratic state, and the rule of law. So as long as the popular movement will continue to be so strong, so united, so mobilized, I think the system, or what the Algerians call usually the pouvoir, will continue to be pushed behind the wall until a real negotiation and transition process will start. But Algerians are also very clear. We are not engaging into dialogue before the concretization of some conditions. And one of the most conditions is the dismissals of the two Bs, what Algerians call the two Bs. So the president of the state, Ben Salah, but also the chief of the government. So a dialogue, yes, but not an open dialogue, a dialogue with some conditions that the civil society, but also political opposition, we would like to engage in.
Okay, so Raouf, Ben Saleh and Badawi have not been dismissed, but we've seen other people being dismissed. We've seen people come under corruption investigations. Don't you want to give these guys some credit to say that at least they're trying to get rid of some rotten apples?
Algerians are very, very skeptic with regards to this because, you know, in order to have an independent justice, this requires time. And for many of my of the Algerian citizens, this is just a settling of scores between clans, between groups of people, and this doesn't really relate to an independent justice. In order to have real justice, I think we should move forward into a transitional justice within the transition period, and then we can definitely leave the justice to work in peace and do its job.
Okay, so Andrew Lebovich, is that accurate that perhaps it's not quite the cronies and the fat cats that are facing justice right now? It's just some of the cronies and some of the fat cats and some of the big hitters getting rid of some of the other cronies and fat cats and big hitters and settling old scores with them. Is that what's happening?
I think it's certainly true that for Algerians, for many Algerians, they see it this way. And as long as Raouf was saying, as long as some members of these institutions that are seen as corrupt and having failed Algerians are still in place, any effort to dismantle other structures, even if it's well-founded, will be seen as at best incomplete because it's not removing the entire system. And again, as Raouf said, it leaves this idea that it's not just score settling, but that this is a kind of cover meant to satisfy people. But even if people might want that, it's still insufficient. And people are going to continue to look at these things with a very skeptical eye.
Andrew, even if it's a cover to satisfy people, even if the intentions were not as pure as they're suggesting they are, when it comes to the postponement of the elections, despite all of that, was it a good move to cancel and postpone those elections?
Well, I think it was certainly a move to show that the popular movement was not accepting any of the transitional proposals put forward. So it was more of a recognition from the government in place and a realization that this government-led transition wasn't acceptable and that these proposals had done nothing to sap the popular movement of its strength. So it was at least a recognition of that fact and a sign that the government slowly is understanding that these piecemeal proposals are just not acceptable and are not sufficient to people.
Raouf, when we talk about this issue being, well, it's an interim period, you need to give it time. I think the big question is, do all the protesters agree on what would be satisfactory for them, satisfactory enough for them to go home and to say, okay, I've done my job on the streets, now I can trust that the ball is rolling? Do they all agree on what those parameters are and what it would take for them to do that?
Of course not. Algerians, have different perspectives and views with regards to the transition period. Negotiations between civil society organizations, but also political opposition are undergoing. Algerians are discussing these issues in the street every Friday and every day of the week. So hopefully by a couple of weeks, we would agree at least on how to converge our visions and have a sort of, at minima, solution or proposal to start a negotiation period. That's what the civil society at least is hoping, with the organization of the National Conference on June 15th, with the purpose of gathering more than 500 people and more than 200 organizations, and to come with a unique document basically listing the different elements of this transition. Right. So Algerians are, they have very, very different opinions. Some are for the Constitutional Assembly, others are for a very short period of transitions. Some are suggest to start with presidential elections, others are more keen to legislative elections, etc., etc. But I think above all, Algerians are capable of overcoming these challenges and come up with a unique solution, a unique proposal to start a negotiation process with the real institution that holds power, which is the army.
Right. Amel, just yesterday, we spoke about Sudan, and we spoke about the fact that the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis were possibly not too keen for Sudan to become democratic. They prefer maybe the stability of an army that's undemocratic rather than the potential chaos of democracy, right? And there's a similar argument with Algeria and a suggestion that there are too many countries with too much to lose if Algeria just becomes an open democracy. How much of that is in your mind and in the minds of the protesters, that outside powers might be meddling and trying to keep the power in power?
Well, it was very clear since the beginning of the protest movement that Algeria will be refusing any kind of foreign interference. They have said so repeatedly each Friday, being the Emirates, being Saudi Arabia, being France, or even the US. So that's a kind of consensus within the people who are protesting. But at the same time, we should not be naive, and we should understand the interest that mainly the US and France have in not getting the situation violent. So there's also a consensus between Washington and Paris that the army should not violently repress the protesters or have any kind of move against basic and minimum civil liberties. But at the same time, what is occurring within on the Algerian scene is also important. We should not be naive. It's a transition that is coming, and it will take time. And the end or the objective is not obviously only just democracy. Raouf was mentioning the differences that are occurring within the civil society movement. Actually, you have three dynamics that are currently taking place. As I said, the army, who is trying to continue its business as usual by having a facade of a president or civilian president and leading from the back. The protest movements and average Algerians who are trying to make their voice heard and trying to get at a minimum consensus between themselves on what kind of society they want for tomorrow. And then you have civil society organizations, and each of these organizations is actually pursuing its own agenda. You have political parties and opposition parties who have been so delegitimized under Bouteflika, who are trying to put ahead the argument for upcoming presidential elections, because presidential elections is their raison d'être, if I can put it that way. They want presidential elections in order to survive. And then you have other NGOs and independent unions and so on who said, no, we want first a national constituent assembly in order to go through a new way to represent Algerians and to be able to have a new regulations, a new constitution that will make institutions more transparent and that will make able for us not to have a new strongman again as the previous president Bouteflika.
And it really does inspire the next question, Andrew, that I guess one of the reasons why the Americans and the French and so on historically have always preferred a very simple, stable, strongman system, because it's easy to understand. As the months have tumbled along and the Algerian protest movement has grown and we're seeing people still on the streets, what would they be thinking now from the former colonial power, France, from the Americans, other Europeans? Who would they be wanting to back, or is it nebulous? Is it unclear about who they can possibly back as they try and hedge their bets?
Well, I do think it's nebulous, and I can't speak for what might be going on behind closed doors in the French system in particular. But I know that at least from the beginning of this, the protest, France and the U.S. to a certain extent have tried to walk a very difficult balance where they don't want to be seen as supporting one side or the other. They don't want to be seen as taking too strong a stance, aside from the fact that the United States and France in particular are very afraid of violence and very afraid of instability in Algeria. So I actually think to some extent they would be happy to accept any solution that would seem to pacify protesters and maintain stability, because really for many outside countries, their major concern in Algeria is just that it remains stable. And I think there's maybe less interest, or somewhat less interest, in how that stability takes shape, because the stability is the main goal.
Yeah, Amel Boubekeur, it's been largely violence-free, and for many, especially after 2011 and so on with the Arab Spring, they were largely surprised by that. What's been the secret to that? The fact that this has been a peaceful revolution and an ongoing process without bloodshed?
Well, it's the whole long history of Algerians who have accumulated techniques of resistance, who have experienced how their demands for change, for political and economic change, have been actually hijacked by the regime and transformed by the regime in order to stay in power. But actually, the question you were asking about the lack of leadership or the possibility for the army to pick up a candidate within its own ranks, actually, it's an outcome of the crisis. It's an outcome of this frozen politics since the so-called civil war in Algeria in the 90s, that there's no possibility to have a successor to Bouteflika. Bouteflika was the perfect candidate because it was giving the impression and the feeling that the civil war has ended, and that we had a civilian governance at the top of the country, and that he will be able to provide a minimum with Algerian with a minimum of democratic tools namely sham elections and multi-party politics. But the thing is that all that was only a facade, and it was the president was unable and even unwilling to actually share powers and to make a real genuine change in Algeria. So these blockages, this impossibility to find a successor, even within the ranks of the army, don't forget that there's no large consensus on Gaid Saleh within the ranks of the army, even on the need for the Algerian army to continue to intervene in politics, even in an informal way. So this crisis is also an outcome of what has been occurring in Algeria for the past 30 years. And that's actually what the movement and the protest movements and protesters are trying to show, that this is the end of a political cycle, that it is now time to think about a new relationship between the citizen and its institutions, a new citizenship, a new relationship between the president and the army.
Really good to talk to all of you. Amel, Raouf and Andrew, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.